IVM.
Hello and welcome to the Habit Coach podcast. I am Ashdin, doctor, your habit coach, and today we have a very special guest with us. He is a human behavioral performance coach. And I know that sounds like a mouthful, but it's so interesting what he does. So I can't wait to have him on our podcast. I want to introduce you to Brian Bogert. And Brian, welcome to the podcast.
Man, I'm grateful to be here. Thanks for building this platform to put good into the world. So I'm looking forward to digging in today, brother.
Yay, super excited. So Brian, what is it that you do? What is a human behavioral performance coach? Like, I'm so excited about that.
Yeah. So at the end of the day, what I do is I have studied human behavior for many years. Right. People ask me, what I'm good at, what I'm an expert in. And, I've had success in business in different categories, different industries, and a lot of great has come from it. But at the end of the day, like what I'm an expert in is people, right? And so when you really look at human behavior, it's really the core of everything we do, right? It's based on our emotional triggers, our behavioral patterns, our environments, how we've been brought up, and our conditioning throughout life. Correct. And there's a lot of common trends, right? When you really pay attention to people, right? There's micro expressions and body language, and there's different emotions that come out. And so when you understand what those things are, and you look at it through the lens of emotional intelligence, and then you can put some real application to it, you can really get to the core of who people are relatively quickly. You can start to see, right, the differences between what their words are saying versus what their body is saying. And you can really start to understand those micro expressions so that you've got the ability to really challenge perspective in those cases. Now, the reason performance coach is on there as well is I'm a core believer. I'm a really, really firm believer that when we get to the root of who we are, right, which includes emotional triggers, behavioral patterns, that's when we have the opportunity to really reach the highest levels of performance in everything that we do. Now, that's not to suggest that we can't reach high levels of performance in either sustained or intermittent periods in certain areas of our life. But what I often find is a lot of high performers end up doing it really, really well in one area, but then there's blocks in other places. Or they think that they're going to kind of be really successful and they keep hitting these walls and they never can quite break through. Well, most of the time people, right, and coaches rely on strategy and tactics. And they say, well, you must be doing it wrong. The strategy must be wrong. The tactic must be wrong. There's some truth to that. And those are important. And that is absolutely a part of the work that we do. But at the end of the day, if we get to the core of the human behavior, the emotional triggers, the behavioral patterns that are really hardwired in all of us, that's when we start to help people become free. And that starts with raising our levels of awareness and intentionality in everything that we do.
Right. So does it start off with with introspection? Does it start off with observation? Absolutely. How do you get into it?
Yeah. So, truthfully, I often ask a lot of my clients to just answer some open-ended questions in the beginning. Right. I always tell my clients in the very beginning that in the onboarding phase of our working relationship, it's going to be like the Grand Inquisition. I have to ask lots of questions. And I'm doing the questions as much for me to understand where they're coming from, how they're operating, the way they answer questions, as it is for them to really hear their own answers. Yes. And so we take that opportunity to capture a lot of what we see, and we start to develop patterns that we see through the course of people's lives. And what we'll see is those patterns often repeat themselves. Yep. And so, and then for me in the one-to-one work that I do, that gives me the opportunity also to know when to kick somebody in the butt, right? To really move them along, or pick them up and give them a hug and be there to keep them accountable in a softer way. I think if we don't have the opportunity as coaches to like really deeply understand, get to know who our clients are, what makes them tick, what keeps them stuck, what keeps them motivated, what's made them successful in the past, and really understanding even the core basics of upbringing and patterns with relationships in life, we can't really create transformation, right? Again, in lieu of all that, and there's phenomenal coaches on this planet that just focus on strategy and tactics, and they get great results. Okay. So in no way am I saying that is a wrong approach. I believe that the most deep and transformational approach to bring joy, freedom, and fulfillment into all categories of life starts with really getting at the root and the core of who they are.
Lovely. So for people who are listening to this and they're thinking, okay, what should I be doing right now? Should you be starting with your intention? Is there a technique that you use to get people down to that, what is my actual intention behind everything that I'm doing or different aspects of my life? How would people drill down into that?
Yeah. So here's the thing. I think that there's a really basic and easy exercise that so many of us overlook, right? I think if we actually pay attention to our bodies and how we react to things, it's a self-regulating body. It tells us what we like, what we don't like, what feeds us, what doesn't feed us, right? And so, particularly in the midst of this pandemic, when everybody has been knocked out of autopilot and we can't rely on those unconscious patterns that really helped us navigate every single day.
Yeah.
Now is a perfect opportunity, especially that many of us have a time to process what's actually been happening, move through it, heal from the grieving process, kind of adjust to being knocked out of autopilot. If you just apply this very simple tactic, take a toll in your life on what are the things that serve you. What are the things that fill up your energy? What are the things that bring you joy, freedom, and fulfillment? Like, what are the things that literally, like when you do them or when you're around those certain people, you feel great. You know what that looks like and what that feels like. We all do, right? Now take a list and take toll on those things that are not additive in our lives. The things that don't serve our greater purpose. The things that don't really drive where we are going to head, right? And we know what that feels like as well. We understand what that emotion feels like in our gut. We know when we feel resistance, and sometimes we decide to do it anyway. Many times we decide to do it anyway because we think we should based on what the world has told us. If we get really clear on these two things, start eliminating things in this category and move more and more into this category, which is, right, what are the things that give us joy, freedom, and fulfillment? What are the things that fill us up and serve our greater good? You know, a lot of people might not know their purpose. In fact, I think more people know what it's not than know what it is. Yeah. And I think that, you know, some people are born and know what they're on this planet to do, and it's very, very clear. But I think there's a lot of people on this planet that their purpose actually finds them through the actions they take in the world.
Correct.
Right? And when they start to align themselves further and further to who they are, it becomes more and more clear on why they're here and what they're supposed to do.
Superb. You know, Brian, there's so much to unpack in what you just said because, you know, I keep getting questions from 24-year-olds, 23-year-olds saying, I haven't found my purpose in life. What am I supposed to be doing? And I'm like, you're 23, right? Should you have a purpose in life at that point of time? Like, is there what according to you in your experiences, when do people find their purpose, or how should they even go about discovering it? Or should they just chill out and say, wait for a bit?
I think often it's on the tail end of that, right? I think there's a hurry up mentality for so many of us. And I do think that there is something to be said about living a certain amount of life. And again, I think purpose finds most people if their eyes are open and their ears are open and they're aligned with who they are. That said, I do think that taking yourself on a little bit of an intrinsic journey, again, even if you just take that simplistic example that I gave and you really look at, okay, everything in this bucket that serves me, what are the things that I think that I can add value in? What are the things that get me really most excited? When I spend time, right, working in some capacity and time flies by, that's honoring my most authentic self.
Yeah.
Right. So if you continue to lean into those types of activities and those things that really build up who you are, at the end of the day, like you might not know in that moment, right, what your purpose is on this planet, but I do believe if you continue to do those activities that serve you, give you that level of freedom and joy, like you're going to find it.
Correct.
And so part of that's just about awareness, right? We need to be really aware of how certain actions and behaviors affect us, right? And not just do things for the sake of doing them, but do things for the sake of being intentional about doing them. And when we do that, right, our purpose starts, again, to become clear. Now, again, most of my clients, most of them don't know what their purpose is when we start working together.
Right.
And through the course of the intrinsic journey that we take them on, which is much deeper than that simple exercise we just did, right? Purpose starts to reveal itself. And so there are things that you can do, questions that you can ask, like really getting clear on who you are, who you need to be. What are the types of things you want to accomplish? What's the mark you want to leave on this world? And how do we systematically build that in through, starting with the end in mind, all the way down to breaking it down to daily disciplines so that our actions can demonstrate who we are to the world.
Lovely.
Often by going through that deep of a process, literally starting with the end in mind and getting down to daily and all the gaps in between, 3 to 5 year vision, annual theme, quarterly emphasis, strategic objectives, imperatives on who I need, like what's imperative in my life. How do I live and breathe into this thing? When you go through that type of work, most people have the opportunity to start to get a glimmer of what their purpose is, even if it might evolve or change beyond that point.
Correct.
At least they'll be directionally accurate.
And have you seen certain mistakes that people make in this purpose journey? That
100%.
that strike up.
Yeah. The single biggest mistake I've seen is that people write down a purpose that sounds eloquent, that they think sounds amazing, that they think is what something would sound good in the world, but doesn't resonate with them at the core.
Right.
At the end of the day, if you start going through this purpose journey and you start to write down, you literally, from a cathartic perspective, get the words out of your body onto paper and you start writing down your purpose. If it doesn't resonate with you, like at your core, probably not your purpose.
Correct.
Right. But I think more people are like, oh, this sounds amazing. I'm going to go do X, Y, and Z with my life. But at the end of the day, I mean, there are so many clients that I work with over a period of 6, 9, 12 months where the purpose they wrote down when we first started working together became very, very clear. That was not their purpose 6 months in when they started to really be paying attention to what resonated with them.
Correct. And I think one way of thinking about this is don't get a purpose that looks cool for other people. It needs to
don't do it
be
for
there
anybody
for
else.
you.
It's got to be for you. That's exactly what that point is. Yeah.
Right? So it's so important to, it doesn't matter if you don't tell anybody about your purpose for the time being. It just should make you feel like you want to get up in the morning, jump out of bed, etc.
That's right. That's it.
Right. And, there was the strategic part to coaching, and you were talking about the behavioral patterns that come up. What are some of the behavioral pitfalls that people find or you see with your coaches in their journey through this purpose or journey through life? What are the behavioral things that stand out for you?
Yeah, so I think some really common ones that impact a lot of people, particularly high performers. Shame is a really big one.
Oh, yes.
Shame is a really, really big one. And shame is the ultimate wolf in sheep's clothing because it masks itself as fear, guilt, worth, all of these things that we don't really identify as shame.
Yeah.
And shame is also the ultimate wolf in sheep's clothing because it actually hits you from both sides.
Yeah.
Right. So on one side, it's I'm not worthy, I'm not good enough. And there's a lot of people who fit in that space, right? Like self-worth and value and all of those things are a deeply ingrained thing that literally have emotional triggers that we feel, we get defensive, we get anger, we get resentful. All these things manifest out of that worth, right? We also get perfectionism, the need to try to prove that we're right or we're smart or so we overcompensate to really, fix this. But when people really start to move through that, they shut that down and they show up in the arena and they're ready to go to war, right? The top side one, and Brene Brown outlines this very, very well, is who do you think you are? Right? I'll tell you, for me, I'm a perfect example. I didn't realize that shame impacted or even played a role in my life for many years. And it's because I didn't live in that worth bucket. I've had moments there. I think many of us have, right? Almost everybody on this planet's like, am I worthy? Am I good enough? At some moment. Yeah. But that wasn't my dominant thought process. Everything major I ever did in my life, I felt the need to apologize for.
Ooh.
I felt like my success made other people feel badly.
Right.
And there was a whole lot that was behind that I had to unpack over the years. But so many of the times when I see these high performers, I think shame is a very common one. And so I've experienced shame. I still get triggered by shame. It's something I have to pay attention to. But because I've experienced it, it's also very easy for me to spot in others. So that is definitely one. I would say that there's also, we deal a lot with scarcity. Scarcity is a big one. Fear is a big one. There's insecurity that's connected to a whole variety of different things. And so, those are just a few of them. But the reason I went to shame is in almost all of the high performers I work with, shame plays some role in their life.
Correct.
And I just think that's kind of interesting, right? Because I think
that's
also
the shame
why
that pushes them for that. Sorry.
Huh?
Sorry, I think we spoke over each other. I was saying, do you think it's the shame that pushes them to the high performance?
Sometimes they're compensating. Sometimes they've got a chip on their shoulder. Sometimes they're trying to do something big. Yeah. Right. And so, but I also have seen in those cases that when we start to remove shame, have them understand shame, have them identify and understand the root of their shame, know what those emotional triggers are. So when they are sparked or triggered by shame, they know what it feels like in their body and they can move that into a level of conscious awareness so they can pause and in those moments choose a different path. Right. So it may have been part of what drove them to where they are. But when we start to free people of shame, it's incredible how high they soar.
Lovely. This reminds me of a story in my life. So I come from a family business, right? So as a result, as a kid, you constantly have to prove yourself saying I'm worthy, etc. And I was the youngest person in my company for probably the first 5-6 years that I was working there. So as soon as I got my opportunity to create my own division, it had to be the fastest growing division, most earning, etc., because those are the chips on your shoulders. And once I got out of that and I realized what I was doing, the growth was doubled, tripled, quadrupled, because now I didn't have that pushing me. I had this, like you said, the intention or the purpose pushing me, the habit coach, etc. is all stuff that is born out of passion, not necessarily I need to prove myself. And
that's right.
And it just explodes.
That's right. Well, and the thing is when we're operating from a position of shame, that also means that we typically have an inability to be vulnerable. right? And what do we do when we don't want to be vulnerable? We literally, you said it, right? Like this crusty exterior, we literally carry an armor around with us.
Yeah.
Right. And what's interesting is, especially in this culture that we're in, particularly for men, particularly for just anybody, right? It's like vulnerability is seen as weakness. It's not. Vulnerability is actually one of the most strengthening things you can do for yourself and those around you. It literally empowers and elevates the entire conversation around you. And so many people think they need to protect from it because I can't be vulnerable. So I've got this armor I'm carrying around, but that armor becomes so heavy that it starts to become crippling to the point that it'll crush you. Right. So it may be what has gotten you to a certain level of success, but to free yourself and get to that next level, like you've got to drop the weight of that armor.
Yeah.
Because that's when you can literally start to go to that next level. And so to your point, it's like when we see that hurdle start to be removed. And the thing about shame is it never goes away, right? Like it's always there. It's just that once you're aware of it, you can start to identify it and have it impact you less.
Correct.
But once that transformation happens, once you move into that space where it's like you're no longer to be dictated by shame, oh man, magic happens.
Yes.
And I've seen it time and time again where results get doubled and tripled. I've got a client I'm working with right now, right? He's been in a certain business. Shame was something that held him back. It also made him make himself small. It made him avoid conflict. It made him not actually show up his most authentic self in so many ways. Multiple years, right? He's been in this same business. Very successful guy. Very successful guy. We've worked together for 9 months. And what's crazy is in the first they have an off-cycle fiscal year. In the first 5 months of this fiscal year, he's generated as much revenue in 5 months as his greatest year ever in history. And in the last 30 days, he's written as much business as his biggest year ever. Right? And that's literally what it is. He's like, I've just aligned myself to really understand that this is how I'm going to operate. Nothing else changed except for him understanding his emotional triggers and behavioral patterns and started to get out of his own way.
Yeah. And where do these behavioral patterns come in from? Like, where do you learn these? Is it something that parents teach us? Is it something that we pick up from society? Where does it come from?
All of the above. Yeah. Yeah.
Right.
So, it's funny we're talking about shame because I think it's one of those things. It's like we get behavioral patterns, and yes, we're products of our environment, right? We're literally conditioned by those around us, the people that lead us, our teachers, our parents, our older siblings, whoever it is, and then society is in general. Right. And so often, right, people are born as the brightest shining light of who they are. And then the world continues to put layers on top of them until they're just a glimmer of what they used to be. If at all that light's even shining. Right. And so I'm talking about shame. I'm a big believer in we've got to remove the word should from our language.
Yes.
Right. Should is a shame-based word. It automatically implies that whatever you're doing isn't good enough. But how many of us growing up heard from parents, teachers, right, counselors, mentors, you should do this. You shouldn't do this. You should go down this path. Oh, you should think about this way. Oh, you should become a lawyer. Oh, it's all these shoulds that tell us who we need to be to the world to fit within the confines of how they believe it's going to be acceptable.
Correct.
And we start to lose who we are in that process.
And getting out of relationships that shame you is so important. Correct. Figuring out how can you stop this from happening, right? Like I know of people in their 50s and 60s, high performance, so big industrialists in India, and they are running on shame. Today was a very bad week. So that's the mindset because that was what the family created for them, right? That's why they possibly could perform at that level. But once you start letting go of that, letting go of the family, and it was an interesting process with this particular client of mine because we started off by talking about him, and then he said, wait, my mother needs to hear this. So then we brought the mother in, and then once she realized what she was doing in the form of shame, she says that, but I never want to do that on my son. Correct?
Yep.
It's probably happening subconsciously. And
most of the time, I don't think it's intentional. I really don't, right? I mean, what parent wants to shame their kid intentionally?
Yeah.
They can't help themselves. They're doing the best they can. I think often that's the case, but that's also why it can be so damaging because we don't even see it. And a lot of these behaviors, triggers, patterns are literally like inherited almost.
Yeah.
Right? Because it just gets passed down.
Are you seeing interesting behaviors form during this pandemic and this lockdown? Interesting things that are taking place in the way people are interacting with each other, behaving or starting to think?
Yeah. So, I think unfortunately there's a whole lot of people that are suffering right now.
Yeah.
And There's many who found a way to move through this. There's many who found a way to establish human connection, but there's a lot of people who are isolated and feeling lonely, who might not have technology to be able to get on Zoom calls. And, there's a whole element to Zoom calls too. There's a level of fatigue that exists just because we're not used to or hardwired to interact this way.
Yeah.
I've personally removed as many hurdles as I can around that. I mean, you're sitting on a 50-inch television in front of me. And the reason is because I have to work less hard to see you, read you, feel you, right? Than if you were even on a 27-inch computer, right?
Okay.
So yeah, I think there's a lot of people. I mean, we're definitely seeing huge spikes in suicide rates. We're seeing huge spikes in mental illness. We're seeing huge spikes in any kind of substance abuse. I mean, you name it, the rates are going up. If you own a liquor store right now, you're probably doing very, very well through the pandemic, right? I mean, we're just seeing this. And what does that tell us, right? When we see those types of substances going up, it's people numbing, right? It's people numbing because they have no other way to cope. It's not necessarily because they're bored, but there's a lot of people who are isolated and lonely. We're seeing way more spikes in domestic violence. We're seeing a lot greater rise in child abuse, right? We're seeing, I mean, it's crazy. I mean, we live in a great area in Phoenix, Arizona, and there are neighborhoods around us. There have been multiple murder-suicides within homes, like in our general area, right?
Wow.
A 10-mile radius from our house. And we live in a great area.
Yeah.
People are hurting right now and they're not seeking help. They're not establishing, healthy forms of coping. They're not really reaching out and building relationships and focusing on human connection. And so, yeah, the patterns I'm seeing right now we're seeing a whole lot of those negative, unhealthy patterns starting to emerge. I think we're also seeing, though, on the flip side, right? There's always two sides to every coin.
Correct.
We're seeing people who've learned that, they've actually gone through that process and realized that they didn't like the path that their life was headed on. They didn't like the amount of alcohol or medicine they were taking, or you name it, right? And they're starting to make changes. They're making healthier choices. We're seeing more families out in public, right? Riding bikes together, walking together, playing at the parks. So I think there's to all the pain and suffering, there's also light that's being shined on, like, opportunity for people to really, learn and grow together. But unfortunately, I think we're seeing a lot more on the negative side right now. And so I just say this very, very clearly to anybody who's listening, like, you're not alone, right? You're not alone. You are worthy. This is something that has happened to all of us. We are feeling it. We're experiencing it as a trauma, as an entire globe, right? That's what it is. There's grieving, there's multiple stages, there's fear to really be able to move through the trauma that we're experiencing, but you're not alone. And so by all means, please reach out, establish connection. There are many people. There's two of us right here on this call that really just want to genuinely help people. So by all means, please don't isolate, don't numb, find a way to connect and heal.
Lovely. And, the concept of asking for help, right? That's a behavioral pattern as well. Some people are just incapable of asking for help.
That's right.
Why? What do you think stops them? How can they change that?
Yeah. So I think, asking for help is a challenging thing because there's a few different ways to look at it. I think people don't ask for help sometimes because they don't feel like they're worthy of asking for help. Some people don't ask for help because they don't want to burden the person on the other side, right? Even if it's an offer, they're like, no, I can't, right? And there's an element of devaluing it. And then sometimes people don't ask for help because they just genuinely think that the other person can't help them, right? And so I look at this, and when I say asking for help, I think we need to ask for help early and often in anything that we can do. And it's something, frankly, that I struggle with, to be perfectly honest. I don't like to put people out, but I also know that if I want to give at a big level, I have to be able to receive and I have to ask, right? And on the mission that I'm on right now to impact 1 billion lives in the next 25 years, it's going to take a lot of help. And so I'm asking for more help right now than I ever have in my life. But when you say, like, how do we put ourselves in a position to help, right? There's a moment of discomfort. There's a moment of discomfort to just get the words to roll out of your mouth. And so don't assume where the other person is going to come from. View the fact that, like, if you're in a position to ask, you are worthy to be asking if you're in that position. And then whether or not the person can help you, you don't know the answer to that until you ask.
Yes.
So don't assume, right? I mean, I had a guy reach out to me on LinkedIn not that long ago. And, one of my sole principles is what I call the if and how principle. And it's just to genuinely determine if and how I can help anybody that I'm interacting with. So we engaged in a little bit of conversation. I immediately closed the conversation. Great to meet you. Please let me know if and how I can help you in any way. And his response was, I'm beyond help. And the challenger in me, of course, wasn't going to let that sit. I was like, and so I just said to him, I said, look, I want to be very careful here because I want to honor and respect what you just said to me. But I said, I also need to understand, like, what do you mean you're beyond help? Yeah. Can you explain that to me? He went off and he wrote multiple paragraphs, which highlighted the fact that he really did need a lot of help, right? But one of the things he wasn't expecting is that he outlined the fact that he has multiple children that are on the autism spectrum. And in COVID in particular, as a special needs parent, like there's an additional burden that special needs parents are carrying right now. Okay. It is that much harder because respite providers are not actually being able to provide services. A lot of OT and speech and different types of therapy are not capable to be received in home or like normal, right? And so special needs parents end up picking up the burden of that. And so he was talking about that, and he was talking about their challenges and their transitions and how difficult this is. Well, what he didn't know is that my son is on the autism spectrum, right? He may not be as severe as his two boys, but my daughter is also special needs and has 2 hearing aids because she's hearing impaired, right? And so again, not to compare and say this is equal, but it's like, brother, like I get you. I see you. I understand the turmoil. I understand how difficult this is. I understand the burden that we as special needs parents carry. I understand how challenging it can be and how it can also be isolating because so many people with typical children don't understand the burden. They just don't, right? And so when he said, I'm beyond help, he just didn't even imagine that on the other side of that LinkedIn message, and this guy's halfway across the globe from me, right? That I'd be able to identify and relate to what he's going through. Then it's gone into a full-blown conversation back and forth with each other. And now he's a big fan and supporter where he's constantly commenting and engaging on content and finding ways to like contribute to the community because it's like he just needed that little glimmer of light.
Correct.
Right? But how many of us are also used to wanting to ask for help and the other person not being active or attentive on the other side?
Yes.
So as much as I want to tell you, like lean into those moments of asking for help, I also want to encourage anybody listening to really lean in and look for opportunities to help.
Yeah.
And pay attention to the fact when people need it, whether or not they are capable of asking. Because if you extend an olive branch, I think there's a good chance they're going to grab onto it.
So beautiful. You know, it's so funny, like you're talking about LinkedIn, even something as simple as Instagram DMs, right?
Yeah.
The number of intense conversations I've had with people on Instagram DMs, I had never thought that's what I would be using my Instagram for. But it's so important. I'm so glad people are reaching out, especially stuff that we talk about on the podcast, like we're going to be talking about in the next podcast about, hitting rock bottom. And people sharing their rock bottom stories with me and, having conversations about it. So it makes such a big difference. And I think there's so much that we've spoken about in this podcast, but it's important to, if I could summarize in a certain way, it's first understand what your behavioral patterns are. What is it that you're doing on the regular, right? How are you reacting to situations around you? Seeing, is there a better way that I could possibly react to this? Figuring it out, like using your website, it's a beautiful resource of learning different behavioral patterns, right? Your poker bullets, I love those 4-minute videos that you're putting out. It's absolutely brilliant because you can immediately say, all right, I love the one about the 500-pound phone, right? Yeah. So simple, so interesting. And you can learn and say, that happened to me as well when I started making my first sales calls. All right, now you can learn about it. So please use these resources, learn about it. And Brian, we're coming to the end of the first podcast. I'm looking forward to the second one. What would you like to leave people as a thought? What aspect should people be focusing on first right now?
Yeah. So it's just going to go to awareness. Right. Here's the thing. Like our minds process 11 million bits of information, but we're only consciously aware of about 40. Right. Think about that. And so what that means is that we're largely led by the unconscious. Right. And so until we go through a systematic process of moving the unconscious to the conscious, the unaware to the aware, we cannot actually truly feel like we have any kind of control or influence in our lives. In fact, quite the alternative. It's going to feel like we're the victim, like it's fate, like life is happening to us. And what I know many of us are hardwired to want, right? It's a couple of things. Human connection, but it's also, we want to feel like we've got some element of control or influence in the destiny of our lives.
Yes.
Right? Like we don't want to feel like we're just pawns in a greater scheme. Like we want to be able to make ourselves and grow ourselves personally, professionally, financially, spiritually. Like we can do that. But it doesn't happen until you start to move things into a place of conscious awareness. Correct. Once you've done that, then you can become intentional with the actions that you take. So that's what I want to leave people with on this, because you're right. That is the theme of this whole first podcast, right? But I want people to understand like this isn't something that just happens, right? This goes literally through an intentional process of trying to increase your level of awareness. And as self-aware as I think I am after years of study and really understanding this stuff, you know what? I still have blind spots.
Yep.
I'm still improving. And the thing I also want to leave people with is there is no final destination. It's a constant evolution of self. And so if we view it that way, then it's not so much about outcome, it's about process. How do I continually refine and become more aware, a little bit more aware every moment of every day, every week, every year? And if we do that, we're going to become a lot more enlightened, joy, free, and fulfilled in everything that we do.
Beautiful. Beautiful. Thank you so much, Brian, for joining us. Brian, how can people reach out to you? How can people connect with you?
Yeah, so you referenced it, my website, right? I think that's probably the best place to look at it. The reality of it is, of those billion people that I want to impact, I am very aware that 99.9999999% will never pay me $1. I'm completely okay with that. I put out a lot of free content because I genuinely want to have an impact. And so there's a lot there between the articles that have been published in Forbes and other periodicals, Bogert's Bullets, and there's very few of my featured podcasts there. That's going to be coming up soon because there've been a ton of those. But on the lens of also offering something free, I want to give you one other place to visit. Go to nolimitsprelude.com. Okay. That's a very succinct, bite-sized version of a lot of our coaching philosophies to help you look at what are some of the right questions to take myself on this intrinsic journey, right? If you aren't in a position to hire a coach, have a mentor, have a friend, have somebody else push you, this is a tool that will help you get more clear on who you are, raise your level of awareness, become more intentional in everything you do.
Superb. Lovely. Thank you so much for joining us on this episode. I'm looking forward to the next one.
Yeah, me too.
Awesome.
If you like this podcast, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can listen to us on the IVM Podcast app or ivmpodcast.com. You can also follow us on social media. We are at IVM Podcasts on Twitter and Instagram. If you want to reach out to me, I am Ashdin Doc on Twitter and Instagram. You can find lots more information on my website, awesome180.com, or check out different content on my YouTube channel called AWESOME180. That's Awesome180.
I hope you enjoyed that show. If you aren't following us on social media, please do. We're IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Want to wish you all a happy Diwali. Hope you had a great festive season. It's been a great week in terms of the kinds of guests we've had and the kind of conversations we've had on the network this week. Do definitely check some of these things out. On This Round's on Me with Gauri Devidayal, she had a great conversation with Garima Arora, who's one of the best known chefs in the world. It was just absolutely riveting. Do check that out. On States of Anarchy, Hamsini Hariran spoke about chronicling India's different wars. Again, really interesting episode. Check that out. Ashdin had a very interesting episode on his show, The Habit Coach. It was called I Don't Feel Like Doing Anything. It's about how to overcome malaise just generally, and I thought really, really interesting stuff. Kumi Vayana was the guest on Cyrus Says on Monday's episode last week, and she's an educator, and my God, it was such a fascinating conversation talking about the way education functions in India and some of the changes she'd like to see. Just really, really interesting stuff. Do give that a listen. On Uncle Please Sit, Anupam Manur was there with Joel and Tushar talking about the Indian economy, part 1 of a 2-part series. Second part will be out this week. You should definitely check that out. Lastly, I want to talk to you all about the Filter Coffee podcast. Karthik Nagarajan, who hosts that show, is on a little bit of a break. He's back with a banger of an episode. It is with Himura Maya, who used to run Landmark Stores, and they talk about the culture of bookstores and quizzing and all kinds of stuff. Really interesting conversation. Do check that out. And with that, I hope to see you again next week.
Sachin Tendulkar, Virat Kohli, Don Bradman, and now Cyrus Brocha. Okay, probably not in the right company. I mean, Don Bradman is Australian. But it's called Cyrus Says, a wonderful show about everything. Find the show on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to podcasts.